Hi everyone, my name is Samantha and today we're going to be talking about debris in space. So for a moment I want you to imagine that all of a sudden all of our satellites just disappeared. What would happen? Well, a couple of really important things would happen. We would lose all of our navigation services. That's going to be our GPS, our global positioning services, and that could lead to so many issues. That could lead to car crashes, plane crashes, and we would have to ground all of those different transportation networks. Additionally, it would lead to monetary issues. So our stock market relies on satellites. That would crash. Credit card readers, banking systems, those would all go down. So we'd lose a lot of our monetary exchange systems. And then we'd also lose ability to use things like televisions or cell phones. So a lot of our communication systems would go down. So it really tells us how important satellites are to our everyday existence. So our entire life would just change in an instant were we to lose all of these. So let's look at how we came to have such a reliance on satellites. So the first satellite we launched into space, we didn't actually launch until 1957 with Sputnik 1. By 1958, the US started to enter space as well. And then from 1958 to 1975, we have what's called the space race. And this was part of the Cold War. So you've got the Soviet Union and the United States kind of battling it out for who's going to conquer space. This continued until the 1970s with détente, where we started to see sort of this easing of tensions with the Cold War. However, despite the space race drawing to a close, we already had developed such a reliance on satellites. Launching of these various man-made objects into space allowed us to explore a new frontier and also allowed this establishment of a satellite communications network here on Earth, which, as we discussed previously, relates to nearly everything that we do day to day. So we're going to watch a quick video here looking at how we sort of got here. So what we're seeing here is we've got low Earth orbit, which is where all of that very dense set of man-made objects are. And we're going to see the 41,000 man-made objects that are currently being tracked. And as the video notes, currently less than 10% of those are actually active satellites. Really everything else is just debris. You can kind of see this very slow accumulation of objects, and it starts to really pick up as we're going through the space race. And here we're going to start watching when the space race draws to a close, but those numbers of satellites are they just keep rising and rising. We have this almost exponential growth of not just satellites, but debris in general sitting up in space. So again, we got that low Earth orbit, and then we also got this high Earth orbit. So we've got Leo and Theo. So you're already kind of getting a good sense. So for now, we will actually move on. So why does all of this matter? You know, you've got debris sitting up there. Why is it important? Well, the problem is that we have speed combined with this debris. So a satellite in high Earth orbit is traveling at 11,000 kilometers per hour. And a satellite in Leo is traveling at 27,000 kilometers per hour. This means that a fleck of paint effectively becomes a bullet. And we can actually see in this image over here to the right, on the lower right-hand corner, that is a hole caused in a window of the International Space Station that was actually caused by just a little fleck of paint, something smaller than my fingernail right there. The damage to the satellite in that upper picture is done by something a little bit larger, but still something incredibly small. And so having all of this debris speeding around Earth, it impacts the active satellites that we have up there. So we come to what we call the tragedy of the commons. We got one more video we're going to watch here.
Back in 1833, William Foster Lloyd noticed something fascinating about the so-called common pastures. In other words, pastures without an owner, which can be used by everyone. He noticed that these common pastures were in considerably worse shape than those which had an owner. Why? simply because the short-term self-interest of the people who were using those pastures made them consume too many resources, and in the long run, everyone suffered. George asked himself, should I buy another animal? And decided that yes, he'd make more money that way. He knew he was overloading the pasture, but didn't care. He wanted the extra money. The problem is that everyone did the same thing. In the end, the pasture was brutally overloaded, and therefore became unusable. Some people made short-term profits, but in the long run, everyone lost. As far as the pastures which had an owner were concerned, this didn't happen, because it was in the best interest of the owners to exploit their property sustainably. Today, similar situations occur frequently. For example, with fishing grounds such as the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, which used to be home to a huge cod population. About 50 years ago, however, technology enabled people to catch a lot more fish than before. The fish population, and thereby the fishing industry, collapsed by the 90s and might never recover. The same way, humans are doing everything from polluting their Earth's oceans and atmosphere to generating traffic jams during rush hour. There we have it. The tragedy of the commons.
All right, so how do we think the tragedy of the commons relates to space systems?
Back in 1833.
So it relates in what we call the Kessler Effect. This is the idea that the density of objects can become enough to cause a cascade of collisions that in turn breed more collisions. So essentially this idea of exponential growth. We've got one piece of debris, collides with a satellite, it causes more debris. And that debris goes out and it collides with more and more and more satellites, and we just have this buildup of extra debris, which could make it near impossible to launch any new satellite or other man-made object into space. And this is essentially how the tragedy of the commons relates to this specific issue. So we're now going to take a look at this thing called Astrograph, which is really quite neat. This is a tracking system that has been employed to track all of our current debris. And the thing I want to draw your attention to is that the orange dots are going to be all of our active satellites. Everything else is going to be inactive, a piece of debris, or something that's uncategorized, which we can again assume is not going to be an active satellite. So we can just see this immense amount of debris that we have sitting around our planet. So why is this a complex problem? We could probably think, well, maybe we just don't launch more satellites. But that's not really an option. And we can look at a very specific example of this. So there's a program called Starlink that's being run by the Tesla company and Elon Musk. We can see a picture of kind of what this idea will look like. It's a program of 30,000 satellites that would create stable internet for the entire globe. There are currently already 1,500 satellites in orbit as a part of this program. That sounds great, right? Internet for everyone. However, as we looked at earlier, an increase in satellites starts leading us closer to a cascading Kessler effect. However, decreasing satellites decreases options for things like communications or internet, simple exploration of space. So we can't just get rid of satellites, but we also have to be careful putting up new ones. That's a very complicated issue that we have. So there's lots of different methods for solutions that we can go about. So I kind of have them categorized here. We have our preventative solutions and our reactive solutions. So preventative is hoping to stop more of this happening in the future. Reactive is reacting to what we've already done. So some of our preventative problems is we can have restrictions on what is launched into space. This could be numbers of items. This is who's allowed to launch items. And then we also have better onboard management systems for our orbit. So this is going to be limiting error in orbit, meaning that it's easier to understand where an object is going to be in space, and also increasing satellite lifespans, meaning that satellites will be active for far longer and we don't have to launch as many new ones. In terms of reactive solutions, we can track our space objects to better understand where they are and try to avoid collisions. So then predicting those collisions, and working on out how to avoid them if we can predict them. And then there's also attempts to remove debris from space. And we have to use a multidisciplinary approach for any of these options. So there's public policy and political science that comes into this. We've got a mathematics, physics, computer science approach. There's also an environmental approach here. Let's start by looking at public policy and political science. So there's a lack of a single overriding international authority that would serve as space's equivalent of air traffic control, according to Kilpatrick. So individual countries need to develop space traffic management programs, and we also need to have a global space traffic management organization. You could think of this as something similar to like the UN, or even on like a slightly smaller scale, something like the European Union in terms of regulations. So we need to establish regulations both around launches and the behavior of objects in space, and have a global unified approach to the epidemic of debris. This means that we can have multiple countries collaborating on projects that work towards debris removal. And then we also need to advocate for awareness within government and in communities for this problem. A lot of people don't know this is an issue, but it's something that could impact them. And it's important that our legislatures understand the impact of science and have very much a science-based understanding of what is going on. Then we have the mathematics, physics, and computer science approach. So part of this involves mathematical models that are going to be based on physical systems that are aided by computational power. And that sounds very complicated, but it really sort of makes sense. So you develop this very theoretical mathematical model that takes influence from our physical systems of how objects operate in space, but then you need computational power to actually run those models. So one current program is called Space Fence. This is a program that would allow for better tracking of what we have in space, but currently it lacks the computational power that is needed to have it be as effective as it could. Another interesting method is we have what's called cold welding. This is a really, really cool idea of how to potentially remove objects from space. The idea is taking essentially a space debris removal system and launching it in space at the right velocity so that when it collides, instead of creating more debris, it does what's called cold welding of the debris to this removal system. This would then move over to something like the International Space Station where it could be retrieved and that those objects could be removed and the removal system could be relaunched. It's really kind of a very cool idea. This actually also overlaps with the approach we talked about previously. Better tracking requires both knowledge of what is launched, as well as increase in observation sites to provide orbit data. So that requires to have this global approach to ensuring that we have that necessary information for the scientists to then use. Now, we can't necessarily do all of that as students. However, there's lots of things we can do. We can make sure that we're prepared as we enter the workforce. So there's various courses that would be very beneficial to these topics. Mathematics courses, such as numerical analysis, intro to partial differential equations, applied nonlinear dynamics, and mathematical modeling all relate to error in systems, the movement of objects, and how we can use mathematical models. In physics, there's optics and laser physics, classical mechanics, computational physics, gravitation and space-time. And if you're interested in something that you could take if you don't want to be a physics or a math student, there's actually a thematic sequence that Miami offers in astronomy, which is physics 111, 211, and 311. And that's something that anyone can take. There's also an environmental economics course, geographic information systems in the geography department, and then public administration and policy analysis. Those don't currently directly relate, but the ideas are very much involved, and we as students can bring up these topics in those classes and look at how they do relate. As we move into the workforce, careers working for NASA, Lockheed Martin, Space Environment Research Center, European Space Agency, all of those organizations work very closely with this issue. There's also research-based fields with top scientists. In this presentation, I used a lot of information from a man named Marie Bajal, and he works out of Texas, and he does a lot of research programs with students. In public policy and environmental fields, you can advocate for this issue to be even brought to the table. And as a smaller thing you can do, there's a space traffic management conference that's held by the International Academy of Astronautics. And that is something that I think a lot of us should strive to be going to learn more about this issue. So thank you so much for listening. Here is a list of my sources from this presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it.